Welcome to New Zealand's South Island. 10 contestants will be dropped here, each carrying only 10 basic survival tools. They will face various wild animals, spend significant energy building shelters, and search for enough protein to sustain themselves. They must also endure endless loneliness. The last person standing will win $500,000. This is a very challenging competition. Let's see who will become the champion. The first contestant is Chase. Before the competition, Chase was a professional soldier employed by the Australian Defence Force. After retiring, he became passionate about outdoor sports and hunting. He has hunted numerous large animals using bows and spears, making this challenge seem easy for him. Soon after arriving, Chase found a stream near camp, providing a constant source of fresh water. Further exploration led him to deer tracks, giving him a promising start. The second contestant is 51-year-old Tamika, participating in her first outdoor challenge. She was excited and a bit shaky upon landing. Before the competition, she researched the 4 essentials of wilderness survival: shelter, fire, water, and food. After collecting some tinder, she began looking for a place to set up camp and decided on a spot in front of a large rock. Not only is the ground flat, but the rock provides a nice seat to enjoy the lakeside view. Before the competition, Tamika was a professional archer and even won the Australian Archery Championship. However, she is a strict vegetarian and has not eaten meat for the past 8 years. She wonders how she will handle the taste of game during the competition. The third contestant is 60-year-old Mike, who was amazed by the scenery upon arrival. After admiring the view, he quickly searched for a shelter spot along the riverbank. Mike has over 20 years of wilderness experience and runs an outdoor survival school. He was also a key player on the national rugby team. To him, winning the prize money is not important. He just wants to prove he is still young. Mike found a deadwood log by the river and used it as an anchor for his shelter, which he set up in no time. Next up is 58-year-old Rick. He first made a mallet from an axe, then started building his shelter. With the right tools, the work went quickly, and he soon had a basic shelter in place. He then began looking for food and was pleased to find deer tracks all over the beach. Maybe soon, he could enjoy a wild deer steak. Before the competition, Rick was a member of the Royal Air Force Special Forces. His years of military experience have given him exceptional skills. Although he is now 58, he claims to be stronger than many younger people. After setting up camp, Tamika began looking for game and soon found deer tracks nearby. The tracks suggested that the deer was quite large, as it had jumped over a log half the height of a person. However, considering she has not eaten meat for many years, she decided it would be wasteful if she hunted the deer and could not eat it. Instead, she chose to start with fishing to gradually get used to the taste of meat again. Chase tracked along the trail for 2 hours, but did not find the deer. Instead, he stumbled upon some bamboo shoots. Thinking that going vegetarian wasn't a bad idea since there was no meat, he gathered the shoots and hurried back to camp. Next, he started boiling water. However, finding dry firewood was challenging in New Zealand's humid air. Chase had to scrape wood shavings with his knife to use as tinder. Surprisingly, this method worked well. Soon, a large bonfire was lit at the campsite. Chase quickly cooked a large pot of bamboo shoots. They weren't very tasty, but at least he wouldn't go hungry today. The next contestant, Leanne, was not as lucky as the others. It took her 2 hours just to find the campsite after landing. The area was damp with ferns, not to mention the swarms of mosquitoes at night, which were enough trouble on their own. Before the competition, Leanne was a wildlife officer. She had a well-known husband, Rob, who had participated in the previous season and had missed his wife after just a few days. Perhaps seeing her husband's poor performance, Leanne vowed to win the prize to set things right. She quickly set up her camp, and as night fell on the first day, the contestants had a tough time sleeping. It wasn't because of wild animals, but rather the swarms of biting mosquitoes that made it impossible to sleep. Tamika probably had the worst time. She said she slept less than 2 hours all night. In the morning, while searching for food, Tamika found a jelly-like fungus that was sticky to the touch and uncertain if edible. She then found some horsehoof fungus, which couldn't be eaten, but was good for transferring fire. However, when Tamika saw the beautiful scenery of the sunlit Golden Mountain, she could no longer move forward. In her words, the scenery was so beautiful it was feast for the eyes, and she could sit and watch all day without feeling hungry. Rick started his second day by meditating by the river, which he said could cleanse the soul. He then plunged into the cold water, which was only 6 degrees Celsius. Watching the old man floundering in the water, one couldn't help but admire his toughness. After bathing, Rick boiled a pot of water. He then discovered a tree hole, which was too damp inside. Otherwise, it would have been useful for storing dry wood. The camera then moved to Mike. In the morning, he was digging a fire pit in front of his camp because the nights were too cold. Although he was 60 years old, he felt like a 30-year-old, but he knew his old boat needed good maintenance. Unfortunately, while working, a key bird kept bothering him. This bird couldn't fly, but was a protected species locally. Mike had to patiently persuade it not to disturb him. After finally setting up the fire pit, Mike was about to start a fire when his asthma, which hadn't bothered him for many years, suddenly flared up. By night, the pain in his chest was so severe that he couldn't breathe. After making an emergency call, Mike collapsed heavily. Later, even the calls from the show's crew went unanswered, which alarmed them. They quickly called for a helicopter to come to his aid. Thus, the first contestant to withdraw from the competition was born. Hopefully, Mike would recover well after returning home. The sixth contestant to appear was 42-year-old Andreas. As soon as he appeared on camera, he was fiddling with his shorts, then used a string to tighten the legs, which he said he would use as pockets for collecting berries. Before the competition, Andreas was a model coach. Although he worked in fashion, he claimed to have a wild and unrestrained heart. In his free time, he was either hunting or on his way to hunt. To win the competition, Andreas had even gained 15 kilograms and brought a bow and arrow to patrol his territory. It wasn't long before he found some traces. The droppings in front of him seemed to be left by a deer, and judging by the smell, the deer was still nearby. Continuing the search, he soon found some fresh hoofprints. Andreas held his breath, hoping to catch a deer at the start. Previous hunting experts would have to call him Big Brother if he succeeded. To lure the prey, Andreas even tried imitating a deer call. However, perhaps because his imitation was unconvincing, the deer did not appear and instead moved further away. After tracking for 4 hours, Andreas finally gave up. It wasn't that he no longer wanted deer meat, but the rainforest terrain made tracking too physically demanding. Disappointed, Andreas eventually had to settle for collecting berries. This hunt had indeed wasted a lot of his energy. On day 3, Rick started working on his bed as soon as he woke up. The place was too cold at night, and to avoid getting cold legs, he decided to upgrade his bedding. First, he found a piece of deadwood to use as a bed frame. Then he spread crushed leaves and moss at the spot for his bed, smoothing them out with his hands before laying down some ferns. This not only provided moisture resistance and warmth, but also added comfort. With such a bed, Rick felt he could live there for 100 days. Next up was Christoph, the 7th contestant this season. Christoph was incredibly lucky. He found a pile of planks while patrolling his territory the previous day. With no rain forecasted for the next few days, he planned to quickly build a permanent shelter. New Zealand's island experiences over 200 rainy days a year, with an average annual rainfall of 7,000 millimeters. With the permanent shelter, he could focus on food gathering. Krzysztof mentioned that he had been camping outdoors with his family since he was in diapers, honing his fishing and hunting skills. His minimal goal for the competition was to last 100 days, surpassing Roland. Krzysztof's shelter featured an A-frame structure with a neat roof without any overhangs. He shaped the collected timber into a trapezoidal structure at the top, then inserted it into another piece of wood. This structure was both sturdy and aesthetically pleasing. Krzysztof then used branches and moss to build a wall, and the shelter quickly took shape. It was clear this contestant was skilled. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Leanne was drying sawdust on a rock. So far, she hadn't managed to start a fire, and with the temperature dropping, her spirits were low due to hunger and the lack of warmth. Fortunately, she found some dry wood in the afternoon and hurried back to her shelter to start a fire. With the dry wood, it wasn't long before a roaring fire was lit in the shelter, temporarily solving the cold problem, though she was still hungry. At that moment, Leanne thought of her disappointing husband. If he had won last season, she wouldn't have had to compete herself. Meanwhile, Leanne wasn't the only one struggling with hunger. Andreas couldn't sleep due to hunger at night. He got up and cooked a large pot of berries and leaves he had collected during the day. Although the result looked like juice, it tasted completely different due to the high fiber content, which formed clumps in his mouth. Despite the poor taste, it did provide a sense of fullness. After eating, Andreas finally fell into a deep sleep, unaware that a deer would visit the campsite that night. A day passed, and Tamika, who had initially chosen a poor location for her shelter, found it cold and damp as it lacked sunlight. Moreover, the nearby lake seemed fishless. After much thought, she decided to move to a sunnier spot. However, several days without food made even packing her bags exhausting. Carrying 100 pounds of luggage, she walked 2 kilometers before finding a suitable place, exhausted. The site faced south and was close to a water source, promising ample sunlight and potentially easier food access. Yet the challenge was to build the shelter before sunset. Meanwhile, Chase was leisurely drinking tea at the camp, reviewing the pros and cons of his deer hunting attempt. Catching deer in the rainforest proved challenging, and he had no energy left to continue the pursuit. He decided to fish instead to replenish his protein. Using wood as bait was an unusual tactic, but surprisingly, it worked when a fish bit the hook. Unfortunately, the catch was an eel, considered a guardian of waterways by the local Maori and thus not edible. Reluctantly, he had to release it, losing a valuable fish hook in the process. Leanne was also fishing on the other side. Unfortunately, she caught nothing all day. She thought about how wonderful it would be to have a meal cooked by her husband, despite his shortcomings. The more she thought, the sadder she became. Eventually, she couldn't bear it anymore and called the production team. After they arrived, Leanne started sharing her feelings in front of the camera. She had thought her husband was incompetent, but only through personal experience did she realize how torturous longing could be. As Leanne left, 8 contestants remained in Alone in the Wild Australia, Season 2. The camera then moved to Tamika. She had started building a permanent shelter, first determining the position of the bed and then constructing the main framework. As she might live there for a long time, Tamika secured every joint firmly. She then covered the structure with a waterproof cloth. Next, she crafted a comfortable single bed. To isolate the moisture from the ground, she elevated the bed several centimeters and covered it with ferns to improve sleep quality. On the 5th day of the competition, Chase was sitting by the shore, looking gloomy. The previous day, mosquitoes had continuously attacked him, targeting his handsome face instead of biting his legs or buttocks. To date, Chase had not consumed any protein. He decided to fish again. As soon as he set up his fishing line, the sun shone on the lake, a good omen. Indeed, a moment later, there was movement on the line. He pulled up a big, edible fish weighing about 2 pounds.
Beautiful colors, right?
No longer needing to starve, he stunned the fish on the shore. The golden, tender fish meat would confuse any contestant. With this fish, Chase became the first contestant to eat protein. On the 6th day, 8 contestants remained. Chase was anxious early in the morning. The previous night, a group of deer had entered his camp, coming as close as 15 meters. However, New Zealand laws prohibit bow hunting at night. Chase had to suppress his excitement and go to sleep. At dawn, he planned to hunt deer in the mountains. However, this hunt was less successful than the last. After hours, he found no trace of deer and realized he was running uphill towards a cliff. He decided to give up and estimated that the fish he had eaten the day before was now fully digested. Thinking further made Chase more depressed, and he sat on the beach, missing his family. Next up was Jack, the 8th contestant. He impressed the audience with his archery skills. Jack was a decorator but had been hunting and fishing for nearly 40 years. With his extensive rainforest survival experience, he felt that Alone in the Wild was tailor-made for him. Jack believed that hunting large animals, like previous contestants, depended on physical stamina. A competent hunter should start with fishing to replenish protein. To cast his fishing line further, Jack innovatively tied the bait and hook to an arrow and shot it out, then retrieved the arrow using the fishing line attached to the arrow's tail. It seems Jack would also be a fishing expert in the future. Next up is contestant number 9, Susan. Judging by her build, she is a tank-type competitor. Susan lives in a particularly primitive area, so primitive that there is no electricity or internet. Most necessities in life must be self-provided. Therefore, Susan thinks participating in the competition is a piece of cake. Her goal this time is to win $250,000. When she returns home, she plans to at least get electricity and water set up. While scouting the area, Susan discovered a large patch of Miro berries. These berries are not only delicious, but also have a sugar content more than 10 times that of ordinary berries. If she can store some, she could outlast many competitors just with the berries. Over at Rick's side, he went into the woods to find some worms for fishing. However, after digging a few, he noticed his shoes were coming apart. Back home, this would not be a problem. But for this competition, he only brought another pair of rubber shoes. If these broke, he might have to leave the competition due to frostbite. He hurried back to the shelter to clean his shoes and found that the soles were almost completely detached from the uppers. Eventually, Rick had to reattach them using shoelaces, but this fix was hardly reliable. The last contestant to appear this episode is Jason. He was leisurely drinking afternoon tea at the shelter. The tea leaves were actually swarming bugs, but Jason didn't mind. He said cooked bugs are all protein. Before the competition, Jason worked as a youth worker living in a bay area in South Wales. His unique living environment endowed him with hunting and fishing skills. His reason for joining the competition was to enjoy some solitude, and winning the prize money would be a bonus. However, 5 days into the competition, Jason hadn't eaten anything yet. On the third day, he found deer tracks on the coast, so he built his shelter by the water to better observe the surroundings. Following the slope upwards, he found no deer tracks, but unexpectedly picked up a beer bottle. After searching for another 3 hours, Jason suddenly felt dizzy. Given that he is the heaviest contestant this season, weighing 240 pounds, his activity consumes more energy. For safety, Jason had to return to his shelter. Later, he considered using the beer bottle as a float, which could be stylish enough to catch lake trout. As the competition reached day 7, Andreas had to stay in his shelter due to rain. To pass the time, he kept scraping wood to make tinder. When the rain stopped, he quickly went fishing, but a heavy downpour soon forced him back to the shelter. He felt very dejected. If it rained continuously for a week, he might have to leave. In New Zealand, the hardest part of hunting isn't the food or weather, but the seemingly harmless mosquitoes. For example, Jack had already been bitten 300 or 400 times on his legs in just 1 week, not sparing his hands either. Frustrated, Jack had to switch to long clothes. He then went to the lake to fish, insisting he wasn't just a week-long contestant. Meanwhile, Susan also went fishing but felt nauseous on the way. She recalled the alcoholic taste of the berries she had in the morning and guessed that the Miro berries might not have been preserved properly, causing them to ferment due to their high sugar content. Half-fermented food can easily cause nausea and diarrhea. Susan had to endure the discomfort and continue on. Finally, she found an ideal fishing spot covered in bird droppings, likely a regular haunt for fish-eating birds. However, after a few swings of her rod, a strong wave of discomfort hit again, forcing Susan to give up fishing and return to her shelter to rest. At night, Andreas always felt as if something was peeping at him. Initially, he thought it was a hallucination from not eating for a long time. However, as time passed, this feeling became clearer. Andreas held his breath and listened for a while before confirming the presence of an animal nearby. Although the rules prohibited the use of arrows at night, he had chosen a shovel from his 10 tools upon arrival. So, he picked up the shovel and started tracking. It turned out that the noise was made by a red-tailed possum. Andreas seized the opportunity and swiftly caught it. Such a rare source of protein could not be left for another night. Upon returning to camp, he stripped down and performed a massage routine before roasting it over the fire. Even without any seasoning, the crispy and charred taste was dozens of times better than beef. After starving for 7 days, Andreas was only satisfied after eating until he hiccuped and then went to sleep. On the 8th day of the competition, Susan spent the entire day and night in bed, only leaving to fetch water, yet she still suffered from severe hiccuping and diarrhea. Her heart rate was also increasing. Susan had to admit she was getting old. By the 8th day of the competition, the production team received news early in the morning that a contestant wanted to withdraw. It turned out that Jason, who performed last, planned to take his bucket and leave. After 8 days in the competition, Jason had not consumed any protein except for insects that fell into his boiling water. He had lost 22 kilograms in 8 days. He did not know if he could survive another day without potentially dying in the shelter. So, even though leaving was embarrassing, it was better than losing his life. After Jason's departure, 7 contestants remained. The camera shifted to 58-year-old Rick, who had resolved 3 of the 4 essentials for survival. Now, he just needed to find some food to sustain himself. Rick dug up some earthworms in the swamp and then went fishing by the lake. When he finally hooked his first fish after longing for one for 7 or 8 days, he was stunned to find it was an inedible eel. Rick had no choice but to release the eel and cast his line again. He waited until almost dark, and just as he was about to return to camp, a second fish bit. Excited and trembling, he pulled it out to find a 3-pound lake trout.
Oh, look at that. Look at that. Beautiful thing. Thank you.
Even though it was completely dark by then, Rick was not going to let this fish last another night. He returned to the shelter and cooked it on a hot iron plate, becoming the second contestant this season to consume protein. On the 9th day of the competition, Susan's hiccuping and nausea had not improved at all, but rather, she had severe diarrhea all day. Hungry and alone, she couldn't help but reminisce about the happy days spent with her husband. But waking up meant facing reality, enduring hunger and trying to control her vomiting. Diarrhea had brought her to the brink of dehydration. If she continued to vomit and have diarrhea, she might also have to take her bucket and leave. Now, she only got out of bed to fetch water, spending the rest of her time lying in the shelter to rest. If given another chance, she would never eat those fermented berries again. The camera then moved to Chase, who had finished eating the lake trout he had caught. With no food left, Chase had to gather some leaves. Although these plants provided some calories, they only contained about 20 calories per kilogram. Fortunately, eating them helped him feel less hungry, so Chase cooked a full pot. At this time, Chase talked about his participation in the competition. His wife was 8 weeks pregnant when he left, and by now, she would be 9.5 weeks. In a few days, they would know whether it was a boy or a girl. But at this crucial moment, he was not by her side, which deeply saddened Chase. He tossed and turned all night, and first thing the next morning, he called the production team. He had made up his mind. Even if he won $250,000, what good would it do if he missed being with his child during such a special time? After all, for a child, there's only one chance like this in a lifetime. After Chase left, there were only 6 players left on the field. Meanwhile, Tamika had finished moving. Once she dealt with the fire pit and chimney, her shelter would become the warmest house of the season. However, the chimney was only half built when Tamika felt a chill on her back. Clouds in the distance seemed to be brewing a small storm. Tamika quickly put aside her work to install windbreak walls using dry trees for the shelter. After exhausting herself, she felt a sudden fatigue. Tamika said it wasn't just from the work. For some reason, she had her period again after a year or 2 of menopause. Knowing that physical stamina and resistance are lower during menstruation, she decided to find some food in the forest. Initially, Tamika planned to cook mamaku leaves, but instead she found a dead tree. After clearing the dead leaves, she only took the tree core back, which is tastier than the leaves and even sweeter when roasted. Carefully cutting a piece, she tasted it and said it reminded her of roasted sweet potatoes, feeling her energy return. On the 10th day, Jack gazed at the distant snow-capped mountains, deep in thought. The white at the top indicated snow had already fallen, meaning temperatures would only drop. Up to now, he hadn't found any food. Sometimes Jack doubted if there was any game nearby. Taking his bow and arrows, he ventured into the mountains again and finally found an animal trail at a crossroads. Here, he planned to set up a motion capture camera to identify the game and devise a targeted hunting plan. Exhausted back at his shelter, Jack had been surviving on the 10 kilograms he gained before the competition, feeling his weight now decreasing. His current strategy was to focus on fishing. Meanwhile, Susan had recovered from her illness, but made the same mistake as Tamika in choosing her shelter location, having to travel far for water. She realized she had been drinking untreated water, which often contains high levels of E. coli and even protozoans, explaining her 2-day diarrhea, not just from berries. Susan was stuck in a dilemma, wanting to move closer to a water source and fishing spot, but lacking the strength to do so after days of diarrhea, barely supported by her body weight. On the morning of the 10th day, Andreas drooled over a paradise duck, but restrained himself as it was a protected species. On day 7, he had caught a possum, still having some of its 2 kilograms of protein left, so he wasn't as hungry as the other contestants. He then began building a permanent shelter, choosing the simple A-frame structure and covering it with a waterproof cloth. His shelter seemed tidier than the others. That evening, he enjoyed a golden, crispy possum leg, which provided energy many times that of beef. The next morning, Andreas checked the camera he had set up earlier in the woods. Although he had food, no hunter could resist the lure of large game. When he checked the camera, a sizable deer appeared, thrilling Andreas. Catching it could make him the champion of the challenge. The competition reached day 13. At this point, there were still 6 players left. Andreas hadn't seen the sun for 3 days, and the continuous rainy weather kept him from looking for food. Deciding not to let fate be dictated by the weather, Andreas chose to fish in the rain. Since there had been no catches near the camp for several days, he went to a bend in the river. To his surprise, he saw an old lake trout as soon as he arrived. Andreas immediately cast his line, and within seconds the trout began to bite. He quickly pulled it up and dispatched the fish. This fish was quite large, providing enough protein for Andreas for 5 days. After a quick cleanup, he hung the fish at the camp. Feeling lucky, Andreas planned to continue fishing. Just as he was crouching by the water, his keen eyes spotted another trout. Repeating the same process, the big fish bit within a few seconds. If not for seeing him cast, one might suspect the fish was planted by the show. This fish seemed even larger than the first, struggling more in the water. Andreas took a while to subdue it. Nevertheless, with 2 fish in one day, Andreas became the wealthiest contestant of the season. Christoph, who hadn't been seen for several days, also came to fish by the lake. He woke up with a headache this morning, probably due to malnutrition from not eating for a long time. Christoph chose a promising fishing spot. Soon, his line tensed. He muttered, "Not an eel, not an eel." But unfortunately, it was indeed an eel. Christoph cursed and released the eel back into the water. So far, he had no catches. His confidence was severely affected. Remembering his grandmother, who endured over 100 days of hunger during the Warsaw Uprising, Krzysztof could only pray to inherit her resilience. Meanwhile, Susan started having diarrhea again. She finally realized that drinking unboiled water might have caused it. Now she hoped her intestines would adapt to the local conditions after 5 days of diarrhea. Regarding the campsite issue, Susan decided it was better to endure short-term pain and move. Without any food supply, undertaking such a big project was risky. Her new campsite was by a creek, with a perfect spot for storing wood. The afternoon sunlight and westerly winds would dry the wood. From a business perspective, this was a good deal. However, all of Susan's materials weighed a total of 60 kilograms. Without strength, she could only move them in 2 trips. Elsewhere, Jack thought of a good way to dig for earthworms. He sawed a piece of wood short, then sharpened one end. He then fixed the processed wood to an axe, creating a tool similar to a pickaxe. With this tool, his efficiency in digging for worms was high. With bait, Jack hurried to fish by the lake. It is said that a person can survive about 30 days on water without food, but irreversible damage begins in the 3rd week. Calculating the time, Jack realized he didn't have much left. Just as he was thinking, he suddenly felt a bite. But when he pulled it up, he was stunned. Not only was there no fish, but he also lost a precious fishing hook. It turned out the sinker Jack used was a stone, which kept getting snagged on underwater rocks during retrieval, eventually causing both the fish and hook to disappear. This left Jack profoundly disheartened, even questioning his ability to survive. 58-year-old Rick smoothed out a sandy area and then drew mountains and rivers on it. He was using skills he learned in the army to plan. He pointed to where the campsite was located. The area around the shelter had already been explored. There were no suitable fishing spots or game. So, Rick turned his attention to the land behind the nearby mountain. According to terrain analysis, there should be suitable hunting grounds there. Although the journey was a bit long, Rick took a sip of water and set off. But after crossing the hills and reaching the area, he found only ferns and no signs of animal activity. Rick decided to return to the camp along the lakeside, passing a creek on the way. He seemed to forget his shoes were Crocs. Crossing the creek, he discovered his shoes were soaked by the icy river water. Rick had to hurry back to the shelter. Back at the camp, Rick fried a big pot of small stones and then poured the hot stones into his shoes. This shoe drying method was indeed a first. He just wondered if the hot stones might damage the shoe glue. On the night of the 15th day, a storm finally arrived. The howling wind and the pitter-patter of rain meant no contestant slept soundly. Even Kristoff felt something fall onto his tent. Thankfully, he had used extra ropes to secure the tarpaulin a few days earlier,